Now, I'm going to be speaking to you today as a phenomenologist, so I don't know how much I speak for all qualitative researchers, but I think these two issues are very important ones. And so I'm going to be emphasizing more methodology than the teaching per se, but this is all implicit in how I teach research. So there are critical methodological issues that challenge all psychological research. Oh, there we go, yeah. Critical methodological issues that challenge all psychological research, and qualitative researchers have developed ways of addressing some of these concerns. Most prominent among these are the questions pertaining to validity and reliability. While originating in the methodological reflections of quantitative researchers, these issues do come up in qualitative research as well. So I'm going to begin with an overview of the issues to be discussed. First of all, although internal validity is usually discussed in reference to confounding variables in experimental research, there can be problems of validity for qualitative researchers that are internal to the data sample itself, in the case of research that utilizes self-report data, and also with regard to the descriptions that result in the analysis of data. In this sense, the concern for validity among qualitative researchers is much more similar to the meaning of validity within the field of psychological assessment than it is to the meaning of validity within experimental research. With regard to the first of these concerns, there's the question of the fidelity of self-report data to the actual events as they were experienced at the time of their original occurrence. My first comment on this is someone also informed by the psychoanalytic tradition, takes us back to Freud's earliest case histories and to the tendency of his neurotic patients to distort their memory of historical actuality. Erik Erikson makes the distinction between psychological reality and historical actuality, the difference between how people remember things and what actually took place. There's no simple given for the psychoanalyst, because what is given to the analyst are the constructions of the patient's memory and of the patient's effort to put their memories, dreams, and emotions into words. Thus, in the very process of grasping the meaning of experiences in order to describe them, our imagination and our ego comes into play. In their classic article on self-report data, Telling More Than We Know, Nisbet and Wilson raised the question of whether self-report data can ever truly represent the psychological processes being studied. Aside from the question of correspondence of the data to the actual experiences, there is a consideration of the face validity of qualitative descriptions, which we'll explore later. Then there's contaminating preconceptions. Beyond the question of the validity of the data, there's the question of how the presuppositions that inform one's data analyses might possibly contaminate one's findings. This is the tautological problem, where research findings can be criticized for only confirming what the researcher already believes to be true. Then we move to external validity. Another set of problems is the question of the validity of individual case studies or other idiographic research for informing a more general understanding of psychological life. How do we cross the threshold from idiographic to nomothetic levels of understanding in phenomenological and other qualitative research? How do we make nomothetic claims when our data are very limited to a small sample? Here we will introduce the phenomenological method of free variation in the imagination, which in effect accomplishes a similar aim as random sampling does in quantitative research. It allows the phenomenologist to generalize from the sample to the population. Finally, if I get to it at the end of this, reliability, in addition to the questions of validity, what happens when you've got two or more researchers confronted with the same qualitative data, posing the same questions even, but we have invariably an expression of their findings in different words, different sentences. Different descriptive phrases will be used to express similar meanings, even while one will find significant divergences among qualitative researchers' readings of the same data. The concern for reliability raises a question: would a particular technique or survey question yield the same result each time? Reliability, as we all know, does not ensure accuracy or fidelity to the phenomenon studied. It just has to do with whether a procedure utilized produces consistent results over time, or consistent results among different researchers. So for qualitative researchers, this is a grave concern. When reflection and description are our primary instruments of measurement, how in the world do we achieve any semblance of reliability in our formulation of our results? So I'll now try to address these one at a time. Just because we do not engage in controlled experiments does not mean that qualitative researchers are not concerned with the first level of validity, which consists of fidelity at the individual level to the phenomenon being studied. We often are studying phenomena like the various emotions, social phenomena, and existential crises that occur in people's lives. Social exclusion, microaggressions, the loss of a child, many such topics that pop up in my research classes. The second level of validity, external validity, can only be addressed after we've first established whether our method of arriving at findings at the empirical level, that is at the level of the sample, has indeed targeted its phenomenon. In some forms of qualitative research, particularly in phenomenological and hermeneutic research, we ask naive research participants to describe their experiences in order to present us with data that the researcher can then reflect upon to arrive at deeper levels of meaning, deeper than what is revealed at the face value in the original descriptions. The reason why we use naive participants is because we don't want our data to be tainted by constructs of a scientific nature. Rather, we seek descriptions as free as possible from explanatory constructs. So our fidelity to our phenomenon begins with care in selecting participants who we believe are capable of describing their experience in such a way that they will not be importing into their description any biases in the form of psychological theories that are floating around or sedimented into our social reality. Once we have our data, whether in the form of written or recorded descriptions, our challenge is to reflect upon that data in such a way that we can arrive at an understanding of what is verifiable by others. So the question of internal validity, the validity of our findings with regard to the sample studied, has two components. First, the finding participants whose experiences actually represent the experience under investigation, and secondly, developing a method of reflection that results in findings that correspond faithfully to the experiences reported by our informants. We will look at these in order, beginning with the question of validity in regards to the data that is collected. To achieve a genuinely phenomenological understanding, the aim would be for the researcher to allow the phenomenon to appear concretely in its own self-givenness, and then to proceed to reflect upon and describe its appearance as best one can without the mediation of theories or hypotheses. This is often referred to as bracketing one's presuppositions, or performing the phenomenological reduction, reducing your focus to just the phenomenon in itself showing in the descriptions of your participants without the interference of mediating theories. To avoid the charge of research bias or researcher subjectivism, where researchers base their findings on their own private experiences, the founders of the phenomenological method in psychology decided to outsource the starting point, to outsource the original description of lived experience. When we ask patients or research subjects to describe their experiences, they do so with many of the same operative defenses and self-deceptions that were inherent in the experiences that they were describing, especially when they're emotional experiences or psychopathological phenomena. Thus, if empirically based phenomenological research is going to achieve fidelity with respect to a lived experience using narrative data, and methods of analysis, then out of concern for the validity of narration, one must consider the possibility of distortion in the reflexive movement from data to findings on the part of the researcher. In practice, there will always be a precarious relationship between an experience and its description for a multitude of reasons. Averill has proposed one understanding of why verbal reports have fallen under suspicion and searching criticism by empirical psychologists. What a person says is under conscious, voluntary control, and hence is subject to dissimulation and conformity to social expectation. And even when a person is not dissimulating in an attempt to present a positive self-image, she or he may not have the ability to report accurately what is taking place internally. The latter charge was the substance of Nisbet and Wilson's oft-cited critique of verbal reports as data. As they saw it, self-reports amount to telling more than we can know. These authors summarized evidence regarding methodological liabilities of using self-report data in the study of higher-order cognitive processes. The central objection they raised was that self-reports are based not on true introspection, but on implicit a priori theories about the causal connections between stimulus and response. Now, the first aspect of their critique regarding the illusion of introspective awareness is based on their distinction between mental content and mental process. When subjects describe their experience, what they're reporting is their awareness of the results of a series of cognitive operations, but not the operations themselves. Thus, when a researcher is interested in disclosing the mechanisms of cognition, self-report data would be deficient to the extent that subjects can only report the contents of their awareness. One of the charges that can be made about cognitive psychologists is that they give priority to the explanation of the mechanisms of experience or modeling of the mechanisms of experience over and against an understanding of the lived experience itself. Since phenomenologists, as well as most qualitative researchers interested in narrative understanding, do not wish to investigate the mechanisms of experience, but rather the meanings as lived, the charge that self-reports do not accurately or reliably describe mental operations is of no concern to the phenomenological researcher, because we have no quarrel with Nisbet and Wilson on this point. Given that the latter's interest is not in the experience, but in cognitive operations, verbal descriptions would have little value for Nisbet and Wilson. The question of the validity of verbal reports thus centers on where those reports are supposed to lead the researcher. As Averill astutely observed, validity does not adhere in a particular kind of data as an intrinsic property. Rather, validity is always relative to the inferences being made. With regard to verbal reports, they conclude that the relevant research indicates that such reports may have little value except for whatever utility they may have in the study of verbal explanations per se. This view is echoed by B.F. Skinner, who stated that, quote, although the use of reports of feelings and states of mind can be justified on practical grounds, there's no justification for their use in theory making because they have no explanatory weight. And that was in his famous essay, The Steep and Thorny Way to a Science of Behavior in 1975. If verbal reports do not accurately reveal the cognitive mechanisms underlying human experience, this is not to say that they're not revelatory of the meaning or the intentionality of human experience. Moreover, we'll see that to the extent verbal explanations are themselves human behaviors, they constitute a legitimate realm of investigation in their own right. So we come up against some problems. The problem of self-deception. Of particular interest to psychological researchers is the charge that verbal reports are prone to error in the form of self-deception or self-justifications. The citing of this as a reason for not using self-report protocols is based on an erroneous assumption that qualitative researchers blindly accept whatever their subjects say as true. This, in turn, is based on the belief that data, in whatever form, are taken as given, and that qualitative analyses of verbal reports would not interpret or otherwise transform the data. In other words, critics assume that qualitative psychologists using subjective self-report data merely intend to take their data at face value. This is a particular instance of the more common misconception of qualitative research as a method of investigation that submits evidence to no external standards, but merely accepts subjective testimony as a basis for scientific knowledge. The face validity of qualitative data is perhaps the easiest to establish, for the simple reason that it is our natural tendency as human beings to think about our experiences, to talk about our experiences, to try to figure out how we got where we are and what does it mean for me that I've broken my leg in the middle of my high school track triumphs. Both thinking and talking involve putting into words what it is that we're experiencing. And in this sense, our data gathering efforts are nothing more than an appeal to what people are already doing with regard to making sense of their experience. Indeed, this has been such a prominent feature of my own experience in teaching research, where this is reflected in some of the thesis titles produced even last year by my advisees. One student wanted to study the phenomenon of miscarriage and realized that in collecting the data from women who had had miscarriages, what she was studying was how they literally came to terms with miscarriage. And thus a phenomenological reframing of the phenomenon of miscarriage becomes coming to terms with miscarriage. what we're all doing. Well, not all of us, but anyone experiencing something like that. Another one had to do with making sense of the experience of being socially excluded or the parental loss of a child. The phenomena that we have our students studying are often existential phenomena, and what is being revealed about them is this coming to terms, this self-understanding. So if what we're trying to understand as phenomenological psychologists is how people make sense of their experience, then self-report data is a certainly fine mode of access to that. Indeed, Viktor Frankl observed that the greatest of human freedoms is the freedom to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. I'm going to move on to the question of validity in regards to the researcher's process. The participant's description functions as a medium through which, as meanings of the subject's experience begin to resonate within the researcher's own experience, the researcher gains access to the world of the subject and at the same time grasps this world as a function of the subject's presence or intentionality. Disclosing meanings inherent in verbal self-report data requires a special involvement on the part of the researcher. The phenomenological approach requires that the researcher enter into direct contact, personal contact with the psychological event being studied. The words of the subject open up a world of experience, and it is this world that the researcher directly and vividly intuits through the protocol data. The descriptive phase of research occurs precisely at the point where I'm ready to thematize or put into words what I've heretofore experienced vicariously. This is precisely what makes verbal port analysis phenomenological in the true sense of the word. What we're doing is putting ourselves into the position of the person's experience by means of empathy. So I throw up a quote from Jean-Paul Sartre: empathy is the only attitude necessary for understanding. If empathy is used to open up the meaning horizons of qualitative data at the individual level, free variation in the imagination is used to attain general external validity, so that findings at the individual level can begin to be generalized to other contexts. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here to get to the question of reliability. The Achilles heel of interpretive research is that confronted with the same data, two or more researchers posing the same questions will be expressing their findings differently. Different words will be used to express the same congruent meanings. And of course, it's likely that different meanings will be thematized as well. So the question arises pertaining to the reliability of qualitative methods. In what sense can a method yield results that are not consistent yet still be considered reliable? Should we alter our definition of reliability to accommodate qualitative methods, or should we adhere to definitions of reliability that have been developed with respect to the quantitative methods? What is reliability? So we begin with a definition from Lewin. It refers to the consistency of a measuring procedure or a measuring instrument. A method of measurement is reliable if it always produces the same result under the same conditions. When measurement takes the form of narrative description that employs connotative language, then the equivalence of description is less easy to establish. If we're counting the number of times a rat presses a bar or the number of copulations of the rat, that's easy to translate into numbers. If we want to compare the relative vigor of the copulatory of two white mice, we find that we enter into different forms of writing the description, and we have to find ways of seeing congruence between different descriptions. So I'm just going to end with a couple of slides. How do we establish the reliability of a method that requires the researcher to place himself into the position of the participant? In a comparative study of several qualitative researchers analyzing the same data, we noticed that there were convergences as well as divergences among the individual researchers' thematizations. So what we look for are points of convergence, and when we have the researchers dialogue with each other over places where they each saw different things that the others hadn't, if the others can confirm what their colleagues were seeing when looking through their biases or through their perspective would be a better way of putting it, if you can confirm what the others saw when standing in their shoes, it's a way of establishing reliability. So the chief point to remember with this type of research is not so much whether another position could be adopted, but rather whether a reader adopting the same viewpoints as those articulated by the researcher can also see what the researcher saw, whether or not she agrees with it. That's the key criterion for qualitative research. And I'm just going to end with a quote by Jacques Derrida: "Everything comes down to the ear you're able to hear me with." That's it.
I'm really intrigued by the idea of reliability in the context of qualitative technology, and I can't break out of my own sense of what reliability is. And I half agree that you're talking about the same thing, and I half can't agree. So with that framing, is there some way to objectify reliability as you're perceiving it, Scott, that would come close to satisfying a quantitative methodologist?
I think the way we would objectify it would be by showing you, for example, 3 different researchers' analyses of the very same set of data, and looking at taking that as your object, taking the final formulations as your object, looking for points of convergence or points of congruence, looking for where they might use a slightly different word, but they're saying essentially the same thing. Now, what can work against reliability is the fact that you might have 3 researchers who also each come up with something very unique that no one else saw. So what we found ourselves doing then was going through a process of verification where we asked each researcher to step outside of their own shoes, step into the shoes of the other, and see if they could see in the data the findings that the other person came up with. So it's a kind of a verification process to establish a working sense of reliability. I don't know how publishable it would be yet, but it's one of the things that we do with our students, so that in a class of 20 or 10, if it's a smaller research group, we have them constantly check each other's interpretations with each other to see if they can see what the other is seeing. And one of the differences between qualitative research and other forms of research is that we're really just looking for possibilities of meaning. We're not looking to say, this is what this experience meant, but is this a possibility of interpretation? So we're taking more of a psychoanalytic approach in that regard.
And so for what it's worth, I take your point, it's a lot easier for me to see how validity sort of coheres and comes together from the different perspectives than reliability, but the proof is in the pudding, you're saying.
Yes,
yeah.
Yes. Thanks very much.